Carl Soderbergh, who's in Stockholm. Carl is the Director of Policy and Communications at Minority Rights Group. Carl, we were talking about Indigenous rights around the world. One of the most shocking examples came in May. Rio Tinto is a company that is valued at $123 billion. And the shocking thing to me about its destruction of sacred Aboriginal sites in Australia was that there are laws, and one of them is from the 1970s, it's the Aboriginal Heritage Act, which allows companies to legally apply for permission to destroy sites like that. I mean, how is that possible?
I think fundamentally what we're talking about is basically a colonial heritage and a colonial attitude towards Indigenous peoples that is still very prevalent today, and also that countries prioritize a form of development that we're seeing is increasingly unsustainable. And the tragedy is that Indigenous peoples then are displaced and that their civilizations are brought to ruin because of these colonial development models that still remain in place.
Is it quite obvious that Indigenous rights are being subjugated for the benefit of economic gain? I mean, we've got Supreme Courts in Brazil, we've got court orders in the United States stopping pipelines and the business activities increasing in the Amazon, but those could only be temporary staying measures. But overall, in terms of economics versus Indigenous rights, there seems to be only one winner every time.
Very sadly, that seems to be the case. I work for Minority Rights Group, and we pursue legal claims alongside Indigenous communities in a number of countries. And we've won cases at the African Court, at the Inter-American Court, so the very highest regional instances. But the problem then is implementation. Companies, governments drag their feet, and ultimately it is always the Indigenous communities themselves who are the losers.
How can governments, and whether they're local, state or national, be encouraged to give Indigenous people more representation on decision-making bodies? Because obviously that will make a difference to how any eventual application is then processed, leading to any eventual decision.
Yes, so while the immediate picture is really pretty dire, at the international level, there's been some gains by Indigenous communities, and that's especially to do with a right to free, prior and informed consent. And this right has gained ground at the UN. Most governments now, in principle at least, say that they support this right. So that means that Indigenous peoples, their representatives, should have a seat at the table when decisions are taken concerning their communities. And ultimately, they should have a right to give their consent or not, because it ultimately is about their lands, their livelihoods, and their civilizations, that their civilizations can continue to thrive and grow as we would like.
There's an argument that the world is slowly heading towards destruction because of all of the extraction from our planet that is happening for the sake of capitalism and its demand for endless growth. Does your organization have any sort of understanding or recommendations to make people understand that possibly Indigenous peoples, and you were talking about their civilizations, that they may actually hold the key to how humanity can protect the environment?
Yes, I mean, this is the key message that we send to governments around the world, is, as we saw in that clip before, to do with this particular case, those Indigenous heritage sites are 46,000 years old. So Indigenous communities are the custodians who point the way to the most sustainable form of development imaginable. So how can we have the arrogance to come in and say that we know better than they do when they've been on these lands for tens of thousands of years? So really what we need to do is turn to Indigenous communities for advice, to learn from how they've managed to be such successful custodians over such a long period of time.
Carl, a really important subject, and thank you so much for your expertise on it. Carl Soderbergh from Minority Rights Group in Sweden. Take care.